Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, yes. Open up, if you will, to the book of Joshua. How many of you are excited to not only start something new, but to have it be the book of Joshua? Anybody? Okay, good. There's some. Okay, good. Woo! It's not just me that's excited about this. All right, good. Well, I trust you have the study guide in front of you, 3 pages long. So we'll be here. I hope you don't have any lunch plans. No, I'm kidding. We even have lunch plans. So I've entitled the series, Trained for Obedience. Trained for Obedience. That's not on your sheet, but you can write it down since I know you have paper. By the way, you don't have to limit your notes to what's on the paper there. You can take whatever notes you want. I got a funny story for you before we get started. Uncle Oscar was apprehensive about his first airplane ride. His friends, eager to hear how it went, asked if he enjoyed the flight. "Well," commented Uncle Oscar, "it wasn't as bad as I thought it might be, but I'll tell you this, I never did put all of my weight down." Oh, come on, that was funnier than that. Well, today as we study the book of Joshua, God wants you to understand the book of Joshua. So how are we to understand the book of Joshua? Well, if you've been through these introductory messages with me before, you're going to know exactly what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at the ways that we understand the book by understanding the place of the book, by understanding the purpose of the book, and by understanding the theology of the book. So the place, the purpose, and the theology of the book of Joshua. So as we get started, the place of the book, let's look at first the author. As my good Bible-believing, scholarly students here, one of the things that's most important as we study the book of any book of the Bible is understanding who the author is. And while this book, Joshua, doesn't specifically identify its author, conservative scholarship asserts that the author is in fact Joshua, the son of Nun. So who is Joshua, aside from who you're looking at right now? Nothing? Rough crowd today. All right. So he makes his debut in the book of Exodus in chapter 17, verses 9 through 14. Now you don't have to turn there. But in Exodus chapter 17, verses 9 through 14, this unforgettable battle with the Amalekites. You guys remember this battle with the Amalekites? Moses is there, and he has to have his hands up. And as long as his hands are up, they win. And when his hands fall, they start to lose. You guys remember this battle from Exodus? It's a great story from the book of Exodus. So Moses needed to have his hands up, and his hands get heavy after a while. So to recreate this, I want you guys to have your hands up like this for the rest of the sermon and see if you can do that.
No.
Think you can do that? I bet Hayden probably could. The girls probably could too. Have your hands up for the whole rest of the sermon. Let's see how that goes for you. You're going to get heavy after a while, and it's going to be tough to hold them up like that. What if you had hundreds and thousands of people who were at battle whose lives depended on the fact that your hands stayed up? That's a lot of pressure. Moses needed help to keep his arms up. Who did he have help keep his arms up? Let's think about this for a minute. Who do you suppose helped him to keep his arms up? Anybody? Any guesses? Joshua! Excellent. Okay, June is awake. Good. All right, anybody else? Joshua. Now for bonus points, who's the other one?
Aaron.
Actually, it wasn't Joshua that held his hands up. It was Hur and Aaron. Joshua led the battle. Moses is not in the battle. Moses has his hands up. And Hur and Aaron have to hold his hands up so that Joshua can lead the Israelite army into battle with the Amalekites. The leader of the Israelite army fighting with the Amalekites at the time was Joshua. And we bump into him again in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 13, where he's called the assistant to Moses. And again, Joshua is called the assistant or servant of Moses in Exodus 33 and verse 11. So when does Joshua rise to such prominence that he can lead the battle in Exodus 17? How old does he need to be by this time? You know, the Bible doesn't tell us. The Bible doesn't tell us how old he is. The Bible doesn't say that he rose in the ranks and became the commander of the army so that Moses could have his arms up. It doesn't tell us any of this stuff. It just simply states that Joshua is leading the battle. And you're like, okay, cool. But if he's old enough to lead the army in battle against the Amalekites, it would seem to me like he was old enough then to have crossed the Red Sea on dry land. He probably remembered Egypt. He saw all of the same miracles. Remember, if you were in Sunday school class and we went through this, remember, Mary? We went through all this stuff in the book of Exodus. The manna from heaven, the water from the rock, the crossing of the Red Sea, miracle after miracle after miracle. In the book of Exodus, Joshua would have had front row seats to all of it, especially as somebody who was able to serve as the assistant of everybody else, Moses. This guy saw it all. All the miracles, all the information, all the stuff. Joshua was there. And later on, as the children of Israel are getting closer to the promised land, according to Numbers 13, Moses sends spies to check it out. And Joshua is one of the 12 spies that goes into the land to check it out. And along with Caleb, Joshua comes back as the only two who give a favorable report to Moses that they can take the land. The other 10 come back with this terrible report that there's giants living in the land, we could never take it, there's no way, why would God bring us here if we could just go back to Egypt? They always just wanted to go back to Egypt. And Joshua and Caleb are the only two that stand up for the Lord and say, you know what, if the Lord is on our side, we can take anything. It doesn't matter how big they are, we can take it. If God's going to give it to us, it doesn't matter who's down there, it doesn't matter how big they are. If God wants us to have it, we can take it. Well, what happens to the children of Israel as a result of this lackluster report from the other 10? The disobedience of those other 10 spies causes this 40-year wilderness wandering that the children of Israel must endure. And God does that so that that first generation can die out. And so that the people that he brings into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua is the second generation of Israelites. And we're going to see how that all plays out as we go through Joshua. And after the death of Moses in Deuteronomy 34, we read the words from verse 9. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, who was full of spirit and wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, so the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Imagine being Joshua at that time. You'd been through the Red Sea on dry land. You lived in Egypt for a period of time. You're being fed manna from heaven. You see all these miracles. You're there. You're leading the battle against the Amalekites. You've been in war. You've been in battle. You wander in the wilderness for 40 years after having gone out as a spy. You see that first generation all die out. And now Moses, the most revered leader of Israel, probably of all time, is now dead. You've seen God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. You've seen God's faithfulness to Moses. How do you think Joshua feels now that Moses is dead? What do you think's going through his blood? What do you think's going through his head? How do you think he feels? Is he nervous, do you think? Is he scared? Is he anxious? Is he fearful? He's been second banana, second fiddle for years. And now it's his turn to step up to the plate and lead these people. Have you ever had to play second banana for a long time to somebody? You ever been second fiddle to somebody for a period of time? Maybe at your workplace, you're the assistant manager for years and years and years and years. All of a sudden, it's your turn to be the manager. Maybe you were in a band and you did play second fiddle for years and years and years. Now it's your turn to be first fiddle. How's that going to make you feel? Excited? Nervous? Scared? How do you feel? It's hard to say exactly how Joshua felt. He probably had all kinds of emotions. The emotion of seeing Moses die is one thing. Having to lead the people is another thing. There were a whole group of people that didn't think they could take the land, and now God says, we're going to go take the land. How's he going to do? What's he going to do with this ragtag group of people? They're not well equipped for battle. They're not organized. He knows the odds that he's up against, because he was one of those spies that went 40 years ago into that place, and he saw it then. He saw how big the people of Canaan were when he was a spy. They were giants. God also revealed earlier on that the people of Israel were not the largest group in the area. In fact, there were 7 other nations that were larger than Israel. So as we think about the odds that Joshua is up against as he's about to take the land of Israel, they were the nation of Israel. Let's think about them compared to other groups in the land. They were not as big physically. Remember, because Joshua saw giants in the land. The people of Israel were not giants, so the other people were bigger. They were not as large numerically. There were 7 other nations in the area that were larger in terms of population. They were not as advanced culturally. They weren't as put together. They didn't have quite the system that other nations did. They weren't as sophisticated politically. They didn't have a system. They didn't have a king. They didn't have a cabinet or a this or a that. They didn't have any of that stuff. They weren't as advanced technologically. You know, they didn't even have iron. You remember the story of 1 Samuel? They didn't have the iron. They had to contract out iron for their farming from the Philistines because they didn't even have iron. They didn't have the same kinds of weapons. So they didn't even have the technological advantage. So they weren't as big physically, numerically, culturally, politically, technologically. And God says, go ahead and go take it. Now that Moses is dead, go ahead and go. How do you think he's going to do? In the face of these odds, God tells Joshua to go. In fact, 3 times in the first chapter, God tells Joshua, verses 6, 7, and 9, to be strong and courageous. I feel like the reason that God has to tell Joshua 3 times to be strong and courageous, because Joshua was feeling probably about this big. And God had to beef him up and say, you know what? You need to be strong. You need to be courageous. Everything's going to be okay. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you as I was with Moses. He's going to tell him over and over again throughout the book, I'm going to be with you as I was with Moses. The people are going to fear you as they feared Moses. I'm going to be with you. It's going to be okay. Be strong and be courageous. It's going to be okay. Because Joshua was probably shaken in his boots. Remember, the only reason we're given any commands in Scripture is because by nature we wouldn't do the same otherwise. So God has to tell him, be strong and be courageous. Because if he already was strong and courageous, God probably wouldn't have to tell him that. So who's the audience? So that's the author, Joshua, the son of Nun. That was his background, his life, his history. The audience, to whom was this book written? We fully understand why this is important. It's so important that we understand to whom it is written. I share this story every time. I'm going to share it again just because I love you. If I write Amy a letter, and I say, my dearest Amy, and I go on to describe how beautiful she is and everything she means to me and how angelic she looks and everything about her is just amazing. And who should I pick on? Oh, Chris, I'll pick on you, Chris. Thanks for being here this morning. You find this letter. And you start to read it. And you're like, I cannot believe he thinks of me this way. That's so wrong on so many levels, isn't it? I didn't write it to you. I wrote it to her. Knowing who the audience is really defines what the letter's all about. Who did Joshua write this book to? Did he write it to you? Did he write it to me? It's for the nation of Israel. He wrote it to the Israelites. It's in the Old Testament. We have to put on our Old Testament hats when we read this. we must first consider that this book is written in the Old Testament. We cannot place into the pages of this book all that we understand from everything else we've read. Joshua does not have the advantage of having the book of Revelation to tell him how everything ends. He doesn't have the epistles of Paul explaining to him the fullness of the riches that we have in Christ. He doesn't know that one day a king named David will shepherd the children of Israel, or that the nation will splinter into two parts after the days of Solomon. He doesn't know about the Babylonian captivity or the return from the exile. So what does he know? Well, a lot of what he knows about God is what he's seen. He has had firsthand witness of so many miracles. As the assistant of Moses, he had a front row seat to the inner workings of the children of Israel. Who knows, maybe he even read some of the original manuscripts of the writings of Moses that we call the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It is with his experience, knowledge, and understanding that he writes this book to the children of Israel. The age of the book. So the author, the audience, and the age. When was this book written? Based on historical evidence and other known dates, it seems likely that the conquest described in the book of Joshua began in 1405 BC. We're about 400 years away from the reign of King David and hundreds of years since Abraham. There's not a whole lot going on in history around the 1400s BC. But this is an important event in the Old Testament, the conquest of the land. Now let's look at the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book, the key themes. So there's a lot of different key themes that are described here by different authors. Many themes have been offered, either as a whole or in part of the book. One author gives these three themes. A transition of power from Moses to Joshua is a theme throughout the book. It is a conquest and division of Canaan. So how do they get it and how do they divide it up? And thirdly, God's faithfulness to his promises. As you remember, Genesis 15 is originally when God described to Abraham the boundaries of the land that he was going to get. In Genesis 12, God told him he was going to get the land. He was going to get some land. He tells him to go, and he starts to go. And in 15, he kind of describes a little bit more fully the boundaries therein. And God is going to be faithful to the children of Israel to get that land. Now, let me ask you this, my good Bible scholars. In the course of time, whether it's the conquest of David, who takes more land, Joshua, as we read here, as he begins to take the land, has the nation of Israel, even to this day, ever gotten the full extent of the land promised in the Bible? No, they have not. So in the 2020, September 20th, what can we conclude about God, his faithfulness to his promises? Must not be very good. Or will they get it in the future? They just haven't gotten it yet. They'll get it someday, won't they? Just because they don't have it yet doesn't mean they'll never get it. So God is faithful to his promises, and he begins to give them the land here in the book of Joshua. Another says that it's God's gift of the land. So the whole book is, the major theme of the book of Joshua is God's gift of the land. And another author, a third author, gives these 7 themes. So God fulfills his promises. So that keeps coming up. Disobedience leads to disaster. And we're going to see that again and again in the book of Joshua as well, that disobedience leads to disaster. True faith requires action. It's one thing for Joshua to say that we can take it. It's another thing when he gets in there and starts taking it. So true faith requires action. We must take possession of what God has promised, as a theme of the book of Joshua. God is a sovereign judge over all of the nations. So Joshua is going to bump into a lot of different nations over the course of this book. And how does God deal with Joshua as he deals with these other nations? Holiness fuels the miraculous. So that's an interesting one. And leadership matters. I challenge you, as you read through the book of Joshua on your own, as you read through it in preparation for each Sunday, as you read through it as a whole, no matter what you do, if you read through the book of Joshua, I'm going to challenge you to come up with your own themes. What are some other things that are going on in the book of Joshua that you can describe and put your finger on? What are some of the themes that you can come up with for the book of Joshua? Well, I've entitled it, Trained for Obedience. As I read the book of Joshua, all I'm seeing is how Joshua has been trained and trained and trained and trained. And he saw the miraculous over and over again as he was the servant of Moses. He was trained for obedience. He knew what would happen if you were obedient to God. You could get manna from heaven. He also knew what would happen if you were disobedient to God. When Moses struck the rock and God says, "You're out," I bet you Joshua was there for that too. And he knows what's happened if you're not going to be obedient. Sometimes to be trained for obedience, you've got to see both sides of that coin. And Joshua did see both sides of that coin. He saw the 40 years of wandering when they decided that they couldn't take it, even though God told them that they could. He saw faithfulness. He saw disobedience. And he was trained for obedience. And as we go through this book, we're going to see what happens to a man who's on fire for God, who's trained for obedience, and who's willing to listen and do what God tells him to do. The key verse. Are you ready for the key verse? Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And they're going to go a lot of different places. So the outline of the book. So generally the book is outlined into 3 different parts. Got to get my pages right here. This is probably the most notes I've ever had for any sermon. Can you believe that? So 3 different parts of the book here. Chapters 1 through 12, subduing. We see a subduing of the land by Joshua in chapters 1 through 12. And then chapters 13 through 21, a settling of the land. So they've subdued it, now they're going to settle in it. And then in chapters 22 through 24, there's a stumbling. Just when you think everything's going well, somebody's got to upright the apple cart, you know? It's always somebody. So as we get a little deeper into this, I remember when I was in college, I took a course on the book of Genesis. It was what we called a module class, which means, typically when you go to school, you go from, let's say, end of August until early December, and that's one semester. And you do all your coursework during the course of that semester. Well, a module was 1 week long, so you did all of that coursework in 1 week. So you got to class at 7 and you didn't leave till 4 or 5 that day for a week. And then you had several weeks after that to do all your papers and tests and stuff like that for the class. It's called a module. I took a module of the book of Genesis. And I remember very clearly that one of the assignments that we had as we went through the book of Genesis is that we had to memorize, maybe not, chapter and verse, but we had to memorize something about every chapter of the book of Genesis. And he had it all laid out for us, what we're supposed to memorize, and it was on a test. And so, even to this day, I can still remember, Babel's that chapter, and okay, the call of Abraham, chapter 12. You just go all 52 chapters long, and you had to memorize all of them. Well, guess what you guys get to do for the book of Joshua? Oh dear, who said that?
Take notes.
Well, you know what? You guys are in luck. Guess what you've got is some notes. And I'm going to make it so simple for you. Are you ready for this? Chapter 1, support. Notice they all start with the same letter. Don't you just, where's Cheryl at? Cheryl always loves all my alliteration. She would faint over seeing this. So chapter 1, support. Chapter 2, what do you think chapter 2 is? What's the S word, do you think? Spies. So spies go out in the land and we meet an interesting lady in chapter 2. Chapter 3, span. They're going to cross the Jordan River. Chapter 4, stones. They lay those memorial stones. Remember that? And by the way, if you've been paying attention to my daily verse that I've been putting online, guess what each day has been for the last week? Joshua chapter 1, Joshua chapter 2, Joshua chapter 3, Joshua chapter 4, Joshua chapter 5, right? Almost like I'm getting ready for this, which I hope you have been too. So chapter 4 was stones, those memorial stones. Chapter 5, sacrament. Remember we talked about the first generation dying off. Now we have to deal with this second generation. There's a sacrament that they have to do. Chapter 6, strategy. Keeping up? Am I going too fast? Oh no. I can't help you with that. So chapter 1, support. Chapter 2, spies. Chapter 3, span. Chapter 4, stones. Chapter 5, sacrament. Chapter 6, strategy. Remember, that's when they go take Jericho, and they have a special strategy that God gives them. Chapter 7 is sin. Somebody's going to do a no-no. We're going to learn about that in chapter 7, the sin. Chapter 8, submission. So after that sin happens, and we get things right, and they actually submit themselves to God, we see what happens in chapter 8. So submission. Chapter 9 is a scandal. Oh, drama, drama, drama. It's like a soap opera. There's a scandal in chapter 9. Read all about it. Chapter 10 is success. And then chapters 11 and 12 are a summary. So what do you think of that? You probably memorized those first 12 chapters now, can't you? Probably almost have half of that memorized, don't you? Who thought studying Joshua was going to be tough? Come on. You want me to? Should we go over them again, or do you got them all? All right, let's run through them real quick here. Support, spies, span, stones, sacrament, strategy, sin, submission, scandal, success, and summary. First 12 chapters of Joshua, just like that. You probably know something about every chapter now as we walk into the book. And then the second section, 13 through 21, the settling. I didn't break that down in any bit because it's just all kind of one big conglomeration of something here. It's the sections. So they're going to section off the land, and this guy's going to get this plot of land, and this tribe's going to get that plot of land, and the Levites get these cities, and on it goes. So the sections. And then the third section, 22 through 24, the stumbling that we find in this third section here. Chapter 22 is the schism. I know, Joe, schism. S-C-H-I-S-M. Schism. Everybody know what schism means? No. It's when there's a break in unity amongst people. So we just got done subduing this land, and we sectioned it all off, and everything's going great, and wouldn't you know it, a few of the tribes start fighting with each other, and there's a schism. Like, come on, guys. Chapter 23 is a salutation. Joshua gives a farewell address. So a salutation by Joshua. Then in chapter 24, everybody's probably got 24:15 memorized. We have it up in our house, actually, in our kitchen. Joshua 24:15. Choose this day whom you will serve. Guess what that S is? Service. Sometimes this stuff writes itself. So schism, salutation, and service. The last three chapters. There's your outline. If you keep this outline and you refer to it each week before you come to church, you're probably going to know exactly what we're going to talk about each day. And 10 weeks from now, when we get to chapter 22 or whatever it is, we're going to be talking about the schism. It's like a red carpet for you guys. Let's study the book of Joshua. So finally, the theology of the book. Now, there's not a ton of theology in the book of Joshua. It's very historical. It's very much written in prose. So there's not a whole lot going on here. But as we think about bibliology, which is the first one, bibliology, throughout the book of Joshua, we see God directly talking to him. Now, bibliology is the study of the Bible and how we got our Bible and the veracity of the Bible. Is it true? Is it trustworthy? Is it faithful? Is it accurate? Those sorts of things. And we can debate about that, and a lot of scholars go back and forth, and who wrote this, and is it whatever, and on and on it goes. But you know what you really can't debate with is if God tells Joshua something, that's probably as good as it's going to get. That is right from the horse's mouth. So that's pretty good. So those are the words of God, just as sure as what we have written down in the Bible itself. And theology proper is number 2. Theology proper, the study of God in general. God shows himself as sustainer to Joshua throughout the book. His character is on display, as is his grace, mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. His power is also on display as the one who gives victory in battle, as well as the one who allows Joshua to be defeated. Number 3 is Christology. Now, there's a really awesome Christophany that we're going to study in chapter 5. A Christophany is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. So you can read the end of chapter 5 if you want to check that out for yourself, but we'll get there in a few weeks. So that's Christology. And number 4 is pneumatology. Now I know that starts with a P. It's kind of like the word pneumonia starts with the letter P. It's the same idea. The word pneuma in Greek means spirit. So it starts with the letter P. Pneumatology. There's no reference to the spirit really in the book of Joshua. Angelology is number 5. There's no real reference to angels either. Anthropology is number 6. There's no reference to the constitution of mankind here. And you're probably wondering, why are we going through these if you're not talking about them? Because you need to be exposed to them so that you understand them. So when we do them in the future, you're going to be like, oh, okay, got it. The more you're exposed to it, the more you'll understand it. The more you hear it, the more often you're going to be able to recognize it in the future. So pneumatology, angelology, anthropology. And number 7 is hamartiology. Starts with an H. Hamartiology. We see the sinfulness of mankind of Achan in chapter 7 and the need for purity of our sins in chapter 7 and verse 13. So sin is very prevalent even with somebody who's trained for obedience, Joshua. We see in his camp a guy named Achan who's not up to snuff. We're going to have to deal with that as we get to chapter 7. Nobody's immune from sin, though. Number 8, soteriology, salvation. So the idea of salvation is keenly related to the concept of submission to God. In fact, the marching orders given to Joshua and the children of Israel aren't all that different from our marching orders. Can you believe that? How many of you ever would have put those two pieces of the puzzle together? The marching orders that Joshua has is to the other countries, submit or die. As we come upon you, you either submit wholly to God or we're going to take you out. That's just the way it is. That's his marching order. And we have the same kind of marching orders. You either submit to God and his son Jesus or you perish. It's the way it is. Ecclesiology is the study of the church. That's number 9. Ecclesiology. There's no reference to the church because this is an Old Testament book. Of course, he doesn't have any concept or clue what the church is or is going to be. So he doesn't mention the church at all. And finally, number 10, eschatology is a study of end times. The Greek word eschatos meaning last things or end times. So eschatology. With all the talk of settling of the land in chapters 13 through 21, this theme is repeated over and over again throughout the Bible. For example, in Ezekiel, it's in Genesis 15. To this day, the nation of Israel has never fully had all the land promised to them by God in the beginning. So as we think eschatologically, I say that one 3 times fast, about the book of Joshua, as he gets land via conquering, he will never get all the land. And even yet in our day in the future, they still have more land to get. So as we think about the training for obedience that Joshua was prepared for, I'm reminded of this story. Arabian horses go through rigorous training in the deserts of the Middle East. The trainers require absolute obedience from the horses and test them to see if they are completely trained. The final test is almost beyond the endurance of any living thing. The trainers force the horses to do without water for many days. Then he turns them loose, and of course they start running towards the water. And just as they get to the edge, ready to plunge in and drink, the trainer blows the whistle. The horses have been trained and who have been perfectly learned, they are obedient and they stop when the whistle blows. They turn around and come pacing back to the trainer. They stand there quivering, wanting water, but they wait in perfect obedience. And when the trainer is sure that he has their obedience, he gives them the signal to go back and take a drink. Now, this may be severe, but when you're on the trackless deserts of Arabia and your life is entrusted to a horse, you better have a perfectly trained horse. We also must accept God's training so that we can obey him. Joshua was perfectly trained as the assistant to Moses, having gone through all the stuff in Exodus, and he's now ready to take that mantle from Moses and lead the children of Israel into the promised land, having been perfectly trained for obedience. As we study this book, let's see how he's going to do. And I'm going to challenge you guys that you need to be as trained as Joshua. Let's pray.